So at the moment, we've investigated get, put, post, and delete. However, there might be a point in time where you want to pass some options into an HTTP client request. Now to do this, we need to look at the definition for something like our .get. So at the moment, all we're doing is supplying first argument, which is a string. And if we hover over here, we have that type definition of string and the URL that we pass in. But we also have an options object, which is optional. Now this contains the footprint for every option that we can then pass into HTTP GET. So this is great for us to then quickly look at the type definitions to get an idea of what the API actually does for us. So you can see here that we have headers. We also have the ability to specify the headers via this HTTP headers object, which I'm going to show you in a moment. Optionally, and this means or, we can pass in a header. So this will be the name of the header and then the string value or an array of strings. We can look at more advanced options such as the context, whether we want to observe the body, which we don't really need to worry about. And the other most common thing that you may be using is this idea of some params. We might want to then take those params and then send them with our request. If we have a look, we have response type JSON, which is now the default. We have some credentials and then some overloads, which means that we can provide some different syntax and different styles of our GET requests and other HTTP client calls. So with this in mind, let's have a look at creating a headers object. Now what I like to do is something like this and break things out into an options object. This then enables us to pass in our options and it all becomes nice and clean. Now the great thing about this is we could abstract this into a method call. So we could return some options that then get used throughout all of our HTTP client calls. We can also use an HTTP interceptor, which we're going to cover in the advanced course, which we can then automatically add things such as authorization headers to all of our requests. But for now, we need to learn about the basics. So inside of this options object, we can specify, for example, some headers. This is then going to be made up of an object. Now, the great thing about this is if we were to spell things incorrectly, even though that we're abstracting the variable and then passing it in, it's going to give us some TypeScript errors. So this is just another reason why TypeScript is a great choice for the Angular framework. Now for our headers, we may be used to doing something such as this. We do content type, and by default, we're using application/JSON. So when we hit save, nothing really is going to happen that's different behind the scenes because Angular is automatically specifying a headers object as application.json. If you need to change this to something else, you now know how to supply a custom header. It could also be that we have an API token, which then contains a special token that we then want to pass off with every request. If we then go inside of the request itself, we can go down to the headers, and you can see that our API token has then been passed off with the headers alongside our accept application.json. Now there may be a better way for us to declare our HTTP headers, which allows us to use an immutable approach. Now for this, we have the ability to pass in an HTTP headers object. So what we can say, if we jump up above our options, we're going to say const headers equals, and we can say new HTTP headers. Now, if you hit enter, this is then going to import in the same line as our HTTP client and the error response, this HTTP errors object. Now you can see here represents the configuration options for an HTTP request. Instances are immutable. Modifying the methods return a cloned instance with the change. The original object is never changed. So what this means is that we can use an immutable object to go ahead and start creating the definitions for our HTTP headers. Now you can see here in the constructor is we can initialize this with a bunch of headers. So first off, let's jump in and we can invoke the headers. We can grab our object and then simply move it into the constructor. Now we can use some shorthand ES6 features. We can hit save. This is then creating our HTTP headers property and initializing it with our object definition. But let's say we want to dynamically add some of these properties. Perhaps we have a base definition that we return our HTTP headers from perhaps a function call, but there may be a specific request that we want to then bind a new property to. Now for this, we can use the API. So we have things such as append, delete, get, has, keys, and set. Now before we go any further, let's jump into the type definitions. We can see has, checks for the existence of a header, retrieves the first value of a given header. We have the keys, which gives us a list of the headers, so you might want to use this to then start working with the headers. We can get all of them. We can then append, which adds a new value to the existing set of the values. And we also have set. Now set is very similar, but it sets or modifies a value for a given header. Whereas append would be for simply creating. Now personally, I like to use append for creating them, and then we can use set to perhaps override them. It might be that we have a different token, but a same header name, and we want to then override it somewhere in our request. So let's go and add, using append, our header that we just copied. Now you can see that we have name and string and value in string. So if we paste in our API token, obviously we're not using an object, so we need to now change this over to comma separated values. We can then hit save, and this basically is then adding that API token to our headers object. And of course we can jump in, go down to our request headers, and you can see that that API token has then been added successfully. Now if you do want to override this, we can further break things out into a headers variable. Because this returns an immutable object, we can say headers equals headers.append. Now if we save this again, we can then go and inspect our request, scroll down to the request headers, and you can see the API token. It might be that we have this logic inside of a function elsewhere in our application. We can then use append, or if you have an existing token, we can then set and modify it. We can bind it to our headers property on the options, pass it into our HTTP request, and everything will then work for us behind the scenes. So it might be a nice idea to use HTTP headers so we know that any of our request headers are not going to be accidentally modified because it returns a cloned object each time. Now, if we used just a plain object, this could be modified somewhere else in our application and potentially leaves us slightly vulnerable.